Handcuff him now. The command cracked through the emergency corridor so sharply that every conversation stopped at once. Nurses froze beside medication carts. Two residents looked up from a rolling X-ray monitor, and even the rhythmic beeping from the intensive care unit suddenly seemed louder. 8 minutes. That was all 16-year-old Nathan Whitmore had left before irreversible damage would begin. The donor heart had finally arrived after a desperate overnight flight across 3 states, preserved inside a temperature-controlled transport container racing through the polished hallways of Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. Every second mattered now. Every heartbeat mattered even more. Yet instead of clearing the path toward operating room 7, 2 hospital security officers stepped directly in front of the man carrying the cooler that held the only heart capable of saving the teenager's life. Dr. Marcus Ellison stopped so abruptly that condensation slid down the silver container onto his gloved hand. His Navy surgical scrubs were stained with fresh blood from the donor recovery procedure he had completed less than 20 minutes earlier. His surgical cap sat crooked after sprinting through 3 connected hospital wings, and his breathing came fast but controlled. He barely looked up before speaking. "I'm Dr. Marcus Ellison. I'm leading the transplant. Please move." One officer frowned instead of stepping aside. His gaze drifted from Marcus's face to the blood across his sleeves. The second officer slowly reached toward the handcuffs, hanging from his belt. "Set the container down," he ordered. Marcus blinked in disbelief. "No, this organ has to stay sterile. My patient is already prepped." The officer's expression hardened. "Sir, put it down now." Around them, whispers spread faster than footsteps. Someone muttered that there had been an incident downstairs. Someone else noticed the blood before noticing the hospital identification clipped beneath Marcus's badge. A woman standing near the waiting area tightened her grip on a designer handbag, as though danger had suddenly entered the building. Marcus shifted the cooler carefully against his chest. "Listen to me. The operating room is waiting. If I lose these minutes, a 16-year-old boy could lose his life." Before anyone answered, the doors leading from the private family lounge swung open. Senator Richard Whitmore strode into the hallway surrounded by attorneys, aides, and members of his security detail. Sleepless exhaustion lined his face, but fear had sharpened every movement. His wife Eleanor followed only a step behind, clutching a folded prayer card with trembling fingers. They had spent 36 agonizing hours waiting for the phone call that finally announced a compatible donor heart. Now they expected hope. Instead, they found confusion. Eleanor's eyes landed on Marcus first. She stared at the blood covering his scrubs before looking toward the officers surrounding him. "What's happening?" she asked. One security agent answered before Marcus could speak. "Ma'am, we're investigating this individual." Marcus immediately shook his head. "I'm not an intruder. I'm the cardiothoracic surgeon assigned to Nathan's transplant." Silence lingered for only a heartbeat before another voice cut through it. "That can't be right." One of the senator's advisors glanced skeptically at Marcus. "Where's the attending surgeon?" Marcus inhaled slowly, refusing to let panic overtake discipline. "I am the attending surgeon." The advisor exchanged an uncertain look with another member of the group. "No," he replied quietly, almost dismissively. "We're waiting for Dr. Lawson." Marcus recognized the name immediately. Dr. Andrew Lawson had retired nearly 8 months earlier. "Dr. Lawson isn't on staff anymore," Marcus answered evenly. "I'm leading this procedure." Nobody moved. Nobody reached for the operating room doors. Somewhere beyond the hallway walls, the operating suite stood completely prepared. Sterile instruments rested beneath bright surgical lights. Anesthesiologists watched the clock. Perfusion machines hummed softly, waiting for the moment a failing heart would be replaced. 8 minutes had already become 7. Marcus could almost hear time slipping away. Not as numbers, but as the fading chance to save a young life that had never met him, never judged him, and now depended entirely on whether the adult standing in this hallway chose to believe the truth before it was too late. Marcus Ellison did not raise his voice. Years of standing inside operating rooms had taught him that steady hands began with a steady mind, even when everything around him threatened to unravel. He looked from one officer to the next, then toward the operating suite where a red light above the doors quietly glowed, signaling that the room was ready. Somewhere beyond those walls, Anesthesiologists monitored Nathan Whitmore's fading condition, while nurses counted instruments for a surgery that could not begin without the surgeon standing in the hallway. Marcus swallowed once and spoke with calm precision. "Please, verify my identification. My credentials are in your system. Call the chief of surgery. Do not waste another minute." His words seemed to disappear beneath the growing tension. One security officer reached for the identification, clipped to Marcus's scrub top, but hesitated after noticing the blood covering the fabric. "How did this happen?" he asked. "I completed the donor recovery procedure less than 20 minutes ago," Marcus answered. "This is exactly where I am supposed to be." The explanation sounded simple enough, yet suspicion had already taken root. Across the hallway, several members of the hospital staff exchanged uncertain glances. Most recognized Marcus immediately. They knew the quiet surgeon who often arrived before sunrise and stayed long after sunset. They knew the physician who volunteered every other Saturday at a free cardiac clinic on the east side of Baltimore, where uninsured families waited outside before dawn simply because they trusted him. Children remembered his smile more than his white coat. Elderly patients remembered that he never hurried them through difficult conversations. Nurses often joked that Dr. Ellison somehow remembered every patient's first name, even years later. None of those stories seemed to matter now. Senator Whitmore stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the cooler Marcus still held securely against his chest. "If you are really the surgeon," he said, struggling to control the fear in his voice, "why have I never heard your name?" Marcus met his eyes without resentment. "Because today is supposed to be about your son, Senator, not about me." For a brief second, silence settled over the corridor. Then another advisor leaned toward the senator and whispered something that Marcus could not fully hear, except for three unmistakable words. "Find another surgeon." Eleanor Whitmore nodded anxiously. "There has to be someone else," she said. "Someone with experience." Marcus answered gently, not defensively. "Ma'am, I have performed more than 400 heart transplant procedures. My team has been preparing for Nathan since the donor became available." His voice remained measured, but inside his chest, every passing second felt heavier. 6 minutes remained. Down the hallway, a young surgical resident named Emily Harper finally pushed through the crowd. She stopped abruptly when she saw Marcus surrounded by security. "Dr. Ellison," she called. "The operating room is waiting." Before she could continue, one of the officers lifted a hand. "Please stay back." Emily stared in confusion. "Stay back?" "He is the lead surgeon." Her words briefly shifted the atmosphere, but uncertainty lingered. One administrator hurried toward the nurse's station, already reaching for a telephone. Another employee began searching the hospital database. Meanwhile, Marcus remained exactly where he stood, refusing to let frustration replace professionalism. He tightened his grip on the insulated transport container, just enough to keep it stable. Every movement reflected years of discipline, because inside rested more than a donor heart. It carried the hopes of parents praying only a few yards away, the final gift of a donor family they would never meet, and the promise Marcus had silently made the moment he accepted the case. No misunderstanding, no accusation, and no humiliation would ever make him forget the real reason he had come running through those hospital doors. His patient was still waiting, and until someone proved otherwise, he intended to keep fighting for the chance to save him. The hallway clock advanced with quiet indifference while everyone else seemed trapped inside the same terrible moment. 5 minutes remained. Somewhere beyond the sealed operating room doors, Nathan Whitmore's heartbeat grew weaker despite every medication the cardiac team could safely administer. A circulating nurse stepped into the corridor, her surgical mask hanging loosely around her neck, her eyes searching for the one face she expected to see. Instead, she found confusion. "Dr. Ellison?" she asked. "We are ready to begin." Before Marcus could answer, one of the security officers gently extended an arm to stop her. "Please return to the operating room." The nurse stared in disbelief. "Return without the surgeon?" Nobody answered. The silence felt heavier than any explanation. Senator Whitmore paced across the polished floor, rubbing both hands together as fear slowly overpowered confidence. He had negotiated legislation, questioned witnesses before congressional committees, and spoken before thousands of voters without ever losing his composure. Yet watching the seconds disappear while his son waited behind those doors left him powerless. Eleanor looked toward Marcus again. uncertainty clouding every expression crossing her face. "There has to be another transplant surgeon in this hospital," she whispered. "Please tell me there is someone else." A hospital administrator hesitated before responding. "There are other cardiac surgeons on staff today, ma'am. However, this procedure was assigned specifically to Dr. Ellison because of its complexity." Before the administrator could continue, another member of the senator's team interrupted. "Call the department chair. Call anyone. We cannot gamble with Nathan's life." Marcus listened without anger. He understood terrified parents. He had comforted hundreds of families during the hardest moments of their lives. Fear often made people search for certainty where none existed. What hurt was not their panic. What hurt was watching assumptions become stronger than facts. Emily Harper stepped forward once more, determination replacing hesitation. "Senator, with respect, Dr. Ellison has spent the last 12 hours coordinating every stage of this transplant. He selected the donor match. He supervised the recovery team. He knows every detail of your son's condition." One advisor folded his arms. "How long has he even been practicing?" Emily answered immediately. "Long enough to become one of the highest-rated transplant surgeons in the region." Another skeptical voice emerged from the crowd. "Then why have none of us heard about him?" Marcus finally responded himself. "Because I spend more time inside operating rooms than in front of television cameras." His calm reply lingered in the corridor. Nobody challenged it, but neither did anyone step aside. The cooler remained safely against his chest, the preservation monitor glowing with quiet precision. Every minute outside optimal transplant timing reduced the margin for success. Marcus knew those numbers by heart. He had taught them to medical students. He had published research explaining them. Now he watched those same numbers become painfully real. At the nurses' station, fingers raced across computer keyboards. Hospital records began loading one page at a time. Credential files appeared. Surgical schedules opened. Another administrator hurried toward the chief medical officer's office while speaking urgently into a telephone. Across the corridor, two younger nurses exchanged anxious looks. "That is Dr. Ellison," one whispered. "He performed my father's bypass surgery." The other nodded slowly. "He stayed with my family until midnight after the operation because my mother was afraid to go home." Their quiet conversation reached Eleanor's ears. She looked toward Marcus again, this time studying not the blood on his scrubs, but the exhaustion in his face. Sweat rested along his forehead beneath the edge of his surgical cap. His gloves still held faint marks from the donor procedure. Nothing about him suggested panic. He looked exactly like a physician focused on one responsibility that mattered above everything else. 4 minutes remained. The administrator suddenly stopped typing. His expression changed. He looked at the credentials displayed on the monitor, then at Marcus, then back to the screen once again. Without saying a word, he reached for the hospital telephone and called the executive offices with a voice that had become noticeably less certain than before. 3 minutes remained. The announcement echoed softly through the surgical communications system, as though the hospital itself understood that time had become the most valuable thing inside its walls. The administrator lowered the telephone from his ear, his expression no longer filled with uncertainty but with growing alarm. He turned toward the security officers. "Do not move him," he said quietly. "The chief medical officer is on the way." The words should have settled the situation, yet they only deepened the confusion. Senator Whitmore stepped forward. "What did they tell you?" The administrator hesitated, choosing each word carefully. "Dr. Marcus Ellison is listed as the attending transplant surgeon for Nathan's operation." One of the advisors immediately objected. "Listed by mistake, perhaps." The administrator shook his head. "The assignment was approved 48 hours ago." Another staff member hurried from the transplant coordination office carrying a tablet. "I found the surgical schedule," she said. "Dr. Ellison has been leading this case since the donor match was confirmed." The hallway became unusually still. Eyes that had been filled with suspicion slowly shifted toward uncertainty. Marcus remained exactly where he had stood from the beginning, refusing to interrupt or demand an apology. His attention stayed fixed on the preservation monitor attached to the transport container. The digital display showed that the donor heart remained viable, but every passing minute narrowed the window for a successful transplant. Emily Harper stepped beside him and lowered her voice. "Doctor, the anesthesia team is asking how much longer." Marcus answered without taking his eyes off the monitor. "Tell them to keep Nathan stable. We are coming as soon as they let us through." Emily nodded and hurried back toward the operating suite. Senator Whitmore watched the exchange carefully. For the first time, he noticed that Marcus spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged there. There was no panic in his voice, no attempt to impress anyone, only unwavering focus on the patient waiting behind the operating room doors. Eleanor slowly approached Marcus, her expression softer than before. "Doctor," she asked cautiously, "how long have you known about Nathan's condition?" Marcus answered honestly. "Since early yesterday morning. I reviewed every scan, every laboratory result, every imaging study, and every medication adjustment before accepting the case. My team and I have been preparing ever since." Eleanor looked down at the cooler in his hands. "You recovered the donor heart yourself?" "Yes, ma'am." "You flew with it?" "No. I rode in the medical transport from the airport after completing the donor procedure." She glanced at the blood on his sleeves once more, but now the sight carried an entirely different meaning. It no longer looked suspicious. It looked like evidence of someone who had been working without rest to save a life. Before she could speak again, another physician rounded the corner at a hurried pace. Dr. Daniel Foster, one of the senior cardiac surgeons, stopped when he saw Marcus surrounded by security. "What is going on?" he asked. "Dr. Foster," the administrator replied, "can you perform Nathan Whitmore's transplant if necessary?" Foster looked genuinely surprised. "No." The answer came immediately. Several people stared at him. He continued without hesitation. "This is Marcus's operation. He planned it. He selected the surgical approach. He knows the donor anatomy better than anyone because he completed the recovery himself. Asking me to replace him now would place the patient at greater risk." His words settled over the corridor with unmistakable weight. Senator Whitmore's advisors fell silent. Even the security officers exchanged uncertain glances. The assumptions that had seemed so convincing only minutes earlier were beginning to collapse under the growing mountain of facts. Then another administrator rushed from the security office carrying a folder. "We have the surveillance footage," she announced. "It shows Dr. Ellison entering directly from the donor transport entrance with the recovery team. Every checkpoint verified his credentials." No one spoke. Somewhere beyond the operating room doors, another monitor sounded a steady electronic rhythm, reminding everyone that while the hallway had been consumed by doubt, a young patient continued waiting for the surgeon who had never stopped trying to reach him. 2 minutes remained. The realization spread through the corridor one person at a time, not with dramatic declarations, but with quiet expressions that slowly changed from certainty to disbelief. The security officer closest to Marcus looked down at the handcuffs still secured around the surgeon's wrists, then toward the hospital identification badge that had now been verified 3 separate times. He seemed ready to speak, but the words never came. Marcus remained composed, despite the growing tension around him. He shifted the insulated container carefully against his side to protect the donor heart from unnecessary movement, and looked directly at the administrator. "Please," he said in the same calm voice he had used from the beginning, "my patient cannot wait any longer." Before anyone responded, the doors to the executive hallway opened, and Chief Medical Officer Dr. Helen Brooks walked briskly toward the crowd. She had not even finished buttoning her white coat after leaving an emergency leadership meeting upstairs. The moment she recognized Marcus standing in the middle of the corridor, she stopped. "Why is Dr. Ellison still here?" she demanded. Nobody answered immediately. The silence itself became the answer. Dr. Brooks looked from the security officers to the senator's advisors, and finally to Marcus. "Explain this." One administrator quietly handed her the security report and the verified credential file. She scanned the documents in only a few seconds before lowering them with visible disbelief. "Dr. Ellison has full clearance. He has led this transplant case from the beginning. Every authorization has already been approved." Her voice became firmer. "Who delayed this operation?" No one stepped forward. Senator Whitmore closed his eyes briefly as the weight of those words settled over him. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, he began replaying the last several minutes in his mind. Nobody had actually asked Marcus who he was before assuming the worst. Nobody had confirmed his identity before questioning his place in the hospital. They had looked at his blood-stained scrubs, his exhausted appearance, and the color of his skin, then built an entire story without evidence. Eleanor slowly covered her mouth with one trembling hand. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "We never gave him the chance to help our son." Dr. Daniel Foster stepped beside Marcus. "Helen," he said to the chief medical officer, "every additional minute increases the risk. We have already lost precious time." Dr. Brooks nodded immediately. "Remove the restraints." One security officer reached forward without hesitation, unlocked the handcuffs, and quietly stepped back. "Doctor," he said, unable to meet Marcus's eyes, "I am sorry." Marcus gently rubbed one wrist for only a second before adjusting his gloves again. There was no anger in his expression. There was no lecture. He simply looked toward the operating room doors. "Is Nathan stable enough to begin?" Emily Harper returned almost at once, breathing quickly after another update from the surgical suite. "The anesthesia team is maintaining him, but they cannot wait much longer." Marcus nodded once. "Then we go now." Before he could take another step, Senator Whitmore spoke. "Dr. Ellison." Marcus turned. The senator struggled to find the right words, but nothing sounded adequate. Every apology felt too small compared with the delay his family had helped create. "If there is still time," he finally said, "please save my son." Marcus looked at the frightened father standing before him. The titles, cameras, advisors, and political influence no longer seemed important. All he saw was a parent terrified of losing a child. He answered with quiet sincerity, "Senator, that has been my only goal since the moment I accepted this case." Dr. Brooks immediately instructed the operating room to prepare for incision, while nurses cleared the hallway and the transplant team moved into position. The atmosphere changed completely. Doubt gave way to purpose. Fear gave way to action. As Marcus walked toward the operating suite carrying the donor heart with steady hands, every person who had questioned him stepped silently aside, creating the clear path that should have existed from the very beginning. The heavy operating room doors closed behind Marcus with a quiet hiss that seemed to separate two different worlds. Outside, guilt, confusion, and unanswered questions still lingered in the hallway. Inside, there was only purpose. Bright surgical lights reflected across polished stainless steel, while every member of the transplant team stood exactly where they had rehearsed countless times before. Nobody mentioned the delay. Nobody asked what had happened outside. Every pair of eyes turned toward Marcus, waiting for the calm leadership they had trusted for years. He carefully placed the insulated container onto the sterile preparation table and looked at each member of the team. "Thank you for holding everything together," he said softly. "Let us save this young man." A quiet chorus of determined voices answered at once. "Yes, doctor." The room settled into its familiar rhythm. Instruments were counted one final time. Vital signs appeared across multiple monitors in steady streams of green, blue, and white. The circulating nurse verified every name, every medication, every surgical step according to hospital protocol. Marcus washed his hands once again, even though he had already completed the process earlier that morning. Warm water flowed over tired fingers while he closed his eyes for only a brief moment. He did not think about the handcuffs. He did not think about the accusations. He thought about Nathan, a 16-year-old boy who had spent too many birthdays inside hospitals instead of classrooms, football fields, or family vacations. Marcus remembered reading through the teenager's medical records late the previous night. Nathan loved astronomy. He wanted to study aerospace engineering one day. He collected photographs of the night sky and could identify dozens of constellations without looking at a map. Marcus had smiled when he reached that page in the file because every patient was more than a diagnosis. Every chart represented a life still waiting to be lived. Emily Harper quietly stepped beside him after completing another equipment check. "Everything is ready," she said. Marcus nodded with quiet appreciation. "Then let us give him the future he has been waiting for." Across the glass observation window, Dr. Helen Brooks stood silently beside several hospital executives. None of them spoke. They watched Marcus move through the operating room with measured confidence, giving clear instructions without raising his voice, thanking every nurse who confirmed a checklist, acknowledging every technician who completed another safety verification. The atmosphere that surrounded him was remarkably peaceful despite the urgency. It reminded Dr. Brooks why the best surgeons were never defined only by technical skill. They were defined by the confidence they inspired in everyone around them. Outside the operating suite, the corridor had become almost unnaturally quiet. Senator Whitmore sat beside his wife for the first time since arriving at the hospital. Neither of them looked at their telephones. Neither of them noticed the reporters gathering outside the medical center. Eleanor continued holding the small prayer card between her hands, but this time another thought kept returning to her mind. She remembered the first words Marcus had spoken when they stopped him. He had not defended his reputation. He had not argued about respect. He had only repeated that a patient needed him. The memory settled heavily in her heart. A few feet away, one of the security officers remained standing near the same wall where Marcus had been delayed only minutes earlier. He replayed every decision he had made and quietly wished he had begun with a simple question instead of an assumption. The polished floor reflected the bright hospital lights exactly as it had before, but the hallway itself felt different now. Conversations had disappeared. Pride had disappeared. Even the constant footsteps seemed softer than before. Through the narrow window in the operating room door, the team moved with quiet precision, while the steady electronic rhythm of the cardiac monitors continued filling the silence. Every person waiting outside understood the same truth at last. Skill had never worn a single face. Compassion had never belonged to one race. And while the hospital waited without speaking, hope slowly returned one careful heartbeat at a time. Nearly 4 hours passed before the first sign of change appeared. The red surgical light above operating room 7 remained illuminated, while the waiting corridor settled into a silence unlike anything earlier that morning. Reporters had gathered outside the hospital entrance, but inside the cardiac wing nobody cared about headlines anymore. Every person who had witnessed the delay now watched the same closed doors with quiet humility. Senator Richard Whitmore sat beside his wife without speaking, his suit jacket folded neatly across the empty chair next to him. Every few minutes he glanced toward the operating room, then lowered his eyes again. Across the hallway, the same security officer who had stopped Marcus remained on duty, even though another shift had already arrived. He had refused to leave. He believed he owed the surgeon at least that much. Inside the operating room, Marcus moved with the same calm precision that had earned the respect of every member of his team. Hours of concentration had erased every distraction from his mind. The accusations, the confusion, the humiliation outside the operating suite had all disappeared the moment he stood beside his patient. There was only Nathan, the carefully coordinated rhythm of the surgical team, and the responsibility every physician accepts the moment another human life is placed in their hands. Emily Harper quietly handed Marcus the next instrument exactly when he requested it. Dr. Daniel Foster monitored each stage from across the table, occasionally exchanging a brief nod with Marcus that required no words. Years of experience had created a language built entirely on trust. Finally, Marcus looked toward the perfusion specialist before shifting his attention to the cardiac monitor. The room became perfectly still, every eye fixed on the display. A long second passed. Then another. Suddenly, a steady rhythm appeared across the screen. The sound filled the operating room with calm, measured beats that seemed almost musical after hours of careful work. Nobody celebrated loudly. Nobody cheered. Instead, several nurses quietly smiled behind their surgical masks, while one technician closed his eyes for a brief moment of gratitude. Marcus remained focused for several more minutes, confirming every measurement before speaking the words his entire team had been waiting to hear. Excellent. Continue with standard closure. Relief spread through the room without disrupting its discipline. Outside, the operating room light finally switched from red to green. The doors opened slowly, and Dr. Helen Brooks stepped into the hallway first. Senator Whitmore stood immediately. "Doctor?" he asked, barely able to breathe. Dr. Brooks smiled warmly. "The transplant was successful. Nathan is stable." Eleanor covered her face with both hands as tears of relief filled her eyes. The corridor that had once been filled with suspicion now filled with quiet gratitude. Before anyone could ask another question, a familiar group entered through the secured elevator accompanied by members of the United States Secret Service. Hospital administrators immediately straightened their posture as the President of the United States arrived for a previously scheduled visit to patients in the cardiac research wing. The visit had been arranged weeks earlier and had nothing to do with the morning's events, yet the timing stopped everyone in place. As the President approached the waiting area, Dr. Brooks greeted him respectfully and briefly explained that an extraordinary transplant had just been completed. Before she could mention the surgeon's name, Marcus stepped out of the operating suite, having changed into clean Navy scrubs after finishing the procedure. The president looked toward him for only a heartbeat before a broad smile crossed his face. "Marcus Ellison," he said warmly, walking directly toward him with his hand extended. "It is good to see you again." The hallway fell completely silent. The president shook Marcus's hand firmly and continued, "I have never forgotten what you did for my brother 5 years ago. Every specialist believed his recovery would take a miracle. You gave him another chance to watch his grandchildren grow up. Our family has thanked you ever since." No one moved. Senator Whitmore slowly turned toward Marcus, the realization settling deeper than before. The man they had doubted only hours earlier was not simply an accomplished surgeon. He was someone whose quiet service had already touched lives at the very highest levels of the country without ever asking for recognition. And in that silent corridor, the weight of every earlier assumption became impossible to ignore. The president released Marcus's hand with genuine respect, but Marcus simply smiled and glanced toward the intensive care unit instead of accepting the attention surrounding him. "Thank you, Mr. President," he said quietly. "The only recognition that matters today is seeing Nathan recover." His answer carried no trace of pride, only the calm sincerity that had guided every decision since dawn. The president nodded with admiration. "That is exactly why I remembered your name." For several long seconds, nobody in the hallway spoke. The silence felt different now. It was no longer filled with doubt. It was filled with reflection. Senator Richard Whitmore slowly walked toward Marcus, stopping only a few feet away. The confidence that usually defined his public life had disappeared. He looked like nothing more than a father who had come painfully close to losing something irreplaceable. "Dr. Ellison," he began, his voice noticeably unsteady, "I owe you more than an apology." Marcus met his eyes without resentment. The senator continued, "Before I knew who you were, I allowed fear and assumptions to influence my judgment. I questioned your place here instead of asking who you were. My family delayed the very person trying to save my son. I will regret that for the rest of my life." Eleanor Whitmore stepped beside her husband, tears still resting in her eyes. "When I first saw the blood on your scrubs," she admitted softly, "I saw danger instead of sacrifice. I never stopped to imagine that those stains came from hours spent, saving another family before you came to save ours. I am deeply sorry." Marcus listened without interrupting. Around them, hospital staff quietly paused their work, not because anyone had instructed them to stop, but because they understood they were witnessing something far more meaningful than a formal apology. The security officer who had placed the handcuffs on Marcus finally approached as well. His shoulders remained tense, and he struggled to maintain eye contact. "Doctor," he said, "I have replayed every decision in my mind. I should have asked questions before making assumptions. I failed you, and I nearly failed your patient. I hope one day you can forgive me." Marcus looked at each of them in turn before answering. Every person in this hallway wanted the same outcome. You wanted Nathan to live. So did I. Fear can cloud good judgment, but it does not have to define who we become afterward. What matters is whether we choose to learn from it. His words settled gently across the corridor. There was no accusation hidden inside them, no desire to embarrass anyone, only an invitation to become better than the people they had been a few hours earlier. The president folded his hands and looked toward the senator. "Dr. Ellison has just given all of us an important reminder," he said. "Character is revealed most clearly when someone has every reason to hold a grudge, but chooses compassion instead." Senator Whitmore slowly nodded. "I intend to earn that lesson." He turned toward Dr. Helen Brooks. "I will work with your hospital and medical organizations across the country to expand training that addresses unconscious bias in emergency medical settings. No family should ever risk losing precious time because someone was judged before being known." Dr. Brooks answered immediately. "Johns Hopkins will gladly stand with you." Emily Harper smiled quietly from across the hallway, remembering the moment Marcus had refused to waste even a single breath defending his reputation when a patient needed him more. She realized that the greatest physicians were remembered not only because of the lives they saved inside operating rooms, but because of the grace they showed outside them. Marcus looked once more toward the intensive care unit where Nathan had begun the long road to recovery. "May I check on my patient?" he asked gently. Dr. Brooks smiled. "Of course, doctor. He has been waiting for you longer than anyone else." Without another word, Marcus walked calmly toward the recovery unit, leaving behind a hallway filled with people who understood that forgiveness could change hearts just as profoundly as medicine could heal them. 6 months later, the first light of an autumn morning spilled across the glass entrance of Johns Hopkins Hospital, turning the windows into mirrors that reflected a city slowly waking to another ordinary day. Inside the pediatric cardiac clinic, laughter quietly replaced the anxious silence that had once filled the same halls. Nathan Whitmore walked through the corridor with steady steps, a backpack resting comfortably over one shoulder and a small telescope case in his hand. His recovery had exceeded every expectation. Physical therapy had become weekend hikes with his parents. Follow-up appointments had become celebrations instead of fearful milestones. As he reached the nurse's station, several staff members smiled and greeted him by name. "You have gotten taller," one nurse said with a laugh. Nathan grinned. "That is what my mother keeps telling me." Eleanor Whitmore smiled beside her son, grateful for the sound of ordinary conversations she had once feared she might never hear again. Senator Richard Whitmore paused near a framed photograph recently placed along the cardiac wing. It showed doctors, nurses, technicians, and support staff standing together after receiving a national award for excellence in patient care. Marcus stood in the back row with the same quiet smile he always wore, almost hidden among the people he considered equally important. The senator looked at the photograph for several moments before speaking softly. "The true heroes are usually the ones who never ask to be seen." Eleanor nodded. "And sometimes we almost fail to see them at all." Down the hallway, Marcus exited an examination room after finishing a follow-up visit with another family. His white coat looked crisp, but his familiar kindness remained unchanged. The moment Nathan noticed him, he hurried forward with youthful excitement. "Dr. Ellison," Marcus smiled warmly. "How is my future aerospace engineer doing today?" Nathan lifted the telescope case slightly. "I finally joined the astronomy club at school. My science teacher says there will be a meteor shower tonight." Marcus laughed gently. "Then I expect you to be outside instead of playing video games." "I promise," Nathan replied. "I want to see every star I can." Senator Whitmore stepped closer, holding a small folder. "Doctor, I wanted you to have this." Marcus accepted it politely and opened it. Inside was a letter announcing the creation of the Ellison Medical Equity Fellowship, a scholarship supporting future physicians from underserved communities while funding advanced education on fairness in emergency patient care. Marcus looked up with quiet surprise. "You named it after me?" The senator answered honestly. "Because every future doctor who receives this fellowship should know the kind of physician whose example inspired it. Not because you are famous, but because you chose compassion when bitterness would have been easier." Marcus closed the folder gently. "Then I accept it only if every student understands that medicine begins by seeing the person before seeing anything else." "They will," the senator promised. Nearby, the security officer who had once stopped Marcus now volunteered during community health events organized by the hospital. As their eyes met across the lobby, the officer offered a respectful nod. Marcus returned the gesture with the same quiet grace he had shown from the beginning. No further words were necessary. Some apologies continued through actions long after conversations ended. As the Whitmore family prepared to leave, Nathan turned back one final time. "Dr. Ellison," he called, "when I graduate from college, I hope I can help people the way you helped me." Marcus smiled, the morning sunlight reflecting softly against the hospital windows behind him. "You already have," he answered. "Every time someone chooses understanding instead of assumption, kindness instead of judgment, the world becomes a healthier place." Nathan smiled, waved, and walked out with his parents into the crisp Baltimore morning. Marcus watched them disappear through the entrance before quietly turning toward another patient waiting down the hall. The automatic doors opened, the sunlight followed him across the polished floor, and without applause, without cameras, and without another word, He continued doing what he had always believed mattered most, saving lives one person at a time.